Hi, my name's Dan Spence, and I'm going to be going through my philosophy for this level design. So the player's goal here is to find a treasure chest, but also at the same time find 15 coins. So I put the player to start underground, and I showed them a little bit of the tree that you saw right there and roots are sticking out. I use a little bit of occlusion to hide this next area with that rock, so when they move into this area, they're able to see the coin that's sitting up there. So they're able to know where the first coin is. I make sure that this looks more like a cave, and I try to use a lot of triangles and a lot of depth to make the player feel a little bit uncomfortable as they move into this area. Now, in this area right here, it looks like it was some kind of a structure and allow the player to explore. And I actually reward them for exploring as I end up hiding a coin off in that area off to the side. So then being in this area, the player is able to kind of investigate some more and then try to figure out exactly how they're going to get up. And in this little area right here, I allow the player to learn a little bit of platforming as they're able to move up and eventually get to that top area. As they get up there, if an additional reward, I end up showing them that there used to be some kind of a civilization there with the little skeleton. So at that point, the player is probably going to want to move on as they explore the rest of this area. I try to give the player a little bit of an uncomfortable feeling as they're moving through because they have to move through these other sharp triangular objects as they eventually move into this wide open space. And once they get in this area, I try to provide a little bit more of a calming presence from the area that they were just in previously. I have a little bit more of the rolling hills, and I try to create a nice general path that the player can follow. If the player chooses to, they can go ahead and investigate this area. Now, as the player moves forward, if they decide to move off to the left, that looks like a definite dead end, I reward the player for going and exploring this area, as there is a coin that they can collect off there. I try to make sure the player goes a little bit farther into the ground so that their elevation changes, adding to a little bit of the uncomfort. As the player moves back out, I try to make sure they'll follow the path, and I try to frame the path using the trees to kind of guide the player exactly where I want them to go, which is down towards that cave. Now, I do reward the player if the player decides to go exploring a little bit off the beaten path of this area. You see there's a little bit of a path that's a little, like just barely showing, and that ends up leading them to a coin off in that area. Now, as the player proceeds forward, they'll kind of go into a little bit of an uncomfortable spot as they go really low into the ground and end up coming back up into another open area, as I'm trying to create a little bit of an emotional journey through shape. Now, at this point, there's a definite area that the player is supposed to go to, but if the player decides to, they could scale this area and platform up, and they're rewarded by doing so by getting a coin. Once they're here, they're actually able to get a little bit of a good vantage point of a temple off on the top of a mountain, and I try to frame that well between the rock right there and that broken tree. So the player then kind of has an idea of where they might be going if they decide to platform up there. So as the player continues on, if they wanted to, they could go around the corner and get another good look. See, there's a little valley right there. And they're able to see a little bit more of that temple that they were looking at in an earlier point. If the player proceeds forward, I try to create a little bit more of a triangular and an uncomfortable environment to represent that this is some kind of a cliff that the player probably doesn't want to go down. If the player does decide to look down it, though, they will get a little bit of a sneak peek of a coin off in the distance that they could get when they end up going down. But I intentionally make that area a little uncomfortable so the player isn't incentivized to kind of jump off the edge. Now, if the player decides to go investigating this little valley a little bit, it's supposed to be a little bit uncomfortable for the player to get in there, but I end up rewarding the player for venturing this area by giving them another coin. Now, if the player decides to, they can go ahead and investigate the rest of this area, and if they go all the way out, I reward the player again with another coin. Now, as the player proceeds back into the area, there's a definite path that I created for the player that kind of leads them down towards a platform that they can then stand on, and they get another good vantage point of the area. So this right here, I tried creating a little bit more of an uncomfortable environment. This is the lowest point of the map right now that they'll be going into here momentarily. Now, as they move down to here, they're supposed to feel extremely vulnerable, and I use occlusion over here to hide that coin, but like I said, if the player does decide to look down that cliff, they'll get a sneak preview of that coin. Otherwise, they might have missed it. And as the player proceeds forward, they'll start seeing a bunch of rocks stacked off in that area, and that is supposed to actually lead to a different part of the map that I'll explain a little bit later. So if the player decides to venture out inside the valley a little bit, they'll be rewarded by finding another coin. And as the player moves forward, I end up using even more occlusion in this area to kind of hide things off to the right side. So I kind of force the player off to the left. And if the player decides to go around this tree and look a little bit more, then the player will be rewarded by another gold coin. So I leave this little breadcrumb trail, and as the player decides to look up, they'll see even more rocks up above them, which ends up leading into this next area. So the player comes out, and they're able to get into this more of an open area. You still have some of the broken trees that create some more triangles to make the player feel slightly uncomfortable to force them to move forward. And as they move forward, I'm hoping that they'll catch those rocks right there, which will then kind of pull them into this area and have them looking up, similar to the rocks in the other area. So seeing those little rocks, I want the player looking up so that they'll find this area right here, and they'll find a body. It looks like it was crushed by a rock. And if they decide to further investigate, then they'll see that this maybe used to be a path that the player could go through. And I try to reaffirm that by the player being able to see the tree off in the distance, but then also being able to see a gold coin. So then the player is able to know somehow they want to move in that direction, which goes off what they were thinking from earlier from seeing the temple, that they probably want to get there at some point. So moving forward through that structure I created, the player is then able to kind of go through that framing and get into this area where it looks like that they could platform to another point. So if the player platforms up, they could use that rock to finish helping them get up in that area. And as they move forward, I'm able to put the player in a more comfortable spot. So I try to use a lot of square geometry here to make the player feel more comfortable and make the player understand that this is the path they're supposed to be going down. I reward the player for also looking around. If they decide to look into these little crevices, I give the player a gold coin. This entire way through, I am trying to incentivize the player to explore by providing them with these gold coins. And the player's able to get another look at the area that they just came through. And then I try to really frame the end goal there, so then the player can actually see the treasure chest. So I try to frame that well so the player then knows exactly where it is they're going. So the player at this point could then go ahead and jump down, and they're able to collect that gold coin they saw through the fallen rocks from earlier. So then the player is able to go over these stairs. And when the player eventually gets to this point, they're able to see that those rocks from earlier, those probably fell off the top, and that's what ended up creating the gap right there. And then for the player looking around, if they happen to catch the right angle, they'll see that little pocket, and they're rewarded by another gold coin. So then when the player eventually gets to the top of the staircase, if they decide to go venturing out a little bit more, they're then again rewarded with another gold coin hidden off in that little pocket. And you're able to see it just barely right there. There is a gold coin behind that tree. And if the player didn't catch that, then if the player decided to, I give the player the opportunity to go around and see exactly what's behind that tree. And then they're rewarded with another gold coin. So then I made sure to end the level off at this really high point, so when the player does collect the treasure chest, they're able to look at the entirety of the map that they've gone through on this journey to eventually get to the treasure chest. So this is ultimately where I want the player to be, at the highest point of the map, while they're experiencing the most rewarding part of their journey, which is finding the treasure chest. So I try to make sure they have something very nice to look at. I put a lot of pyramids in the background that kind of complement the mountains. And I really wanted the player to feel fulfilled when they got to this point by doing so. So I'd like to thank everyone for listening, and have a great day.